The file begins. January 2026. The internet became his digital coffin. While the world saw headlines, Andrew saw the unsealing of his own tomb. The new documents were not just text. They were pixelated ghosts from a life he swore he never lived. Among the spreadsheets of flight logs was a new, damning entry, a private charter to Paris, dated 3 days after he claimed to have severed all ties. A trip not with Epstein, but with one of his known recruiters. Pause. The true poison, however, was a scanned cocktail napkin. On it, in Andrew's own looping script, a note to Epstein. A most amusing evening. The cellar is impressive, but the collection upstairs is unparalleled. This single sentence, scrawled in blue ink, became the anatomy of his final fall. His reaction was not rage. It was silence. A profound, hollow silence that filled the 30 rooms of the Royal Lodge, a silence so heavy it seemed to bend the light. The monarchy had survived wars and revolutions. It was now being dismantled by a piece of bar stationery. This was the curse of his one fatal mistake. An error so profound it became a hereditary disease, tainting the bloodline he was born to represent. His name was no longer a title. It was a diagnosis. The stripping of His Royal Highness wasn't a punishment. It was an amputation, performed by his own brother to stop the gangrene from reaching the throne. His crippled destiny was now an exercise in subtraction. First the duties, then the honorifics, then the art from the walls. Soon the house itself. Talk of a move to Paws Marsh Farm was not a relocation. It was an exile to the provinces, a gilded cage shrinking to the size of a country cottage. The public, once subjects, now saw him as a specter. A cautionary tale told in hushed tones about how the brightest of fortunes can be squandered for the darkest of appetites. He had become a living audit of his own sins, his balance sheet showing nothing but moral debt. That debt began accruing at birth. A second son, the spare, born into a system that guarantees privilege but not purpose. His childhood was not a preparation for life. It was a curated exhibition of it, a hermetically sealed reality of palace corridors and naval discipline. The Falklands War gave him a brief, intoxicating taste of relevance, a hero's narrative. But heroism is a currency that devalues quickly in peacetime. His service record became a faded photograph in a scrapbook of past glories. The structure of the military was replaced by the vacuum of royal life, a life of handshakes and ribbon cuttings. It was a gilded cage, and he began searching for a different kind of door, a darker exit. This search for a new battlefield, one fought in boardrooms and on private islands, became the original sin. The first entry in a ledger that would end in total ruin. The anatomy of his fall began not with a bang, but with a handshake. He traded the rigid hierarchy of the Navy for a world of fluid transactions and ambiguous morality. He became a trade envoy, but the real commodity he was trading was his own name, a key that opened any door. This is where the shadows lengthened, where men with easy smiles and bottomless accounts entered the frame. Men like Giuffre Epstein. It wasn't a friendship. It was a merger of assets. Andrew offered the legitimacy of 1,000 years of monarchy. Epstein offered a lifestyle free from scrutiny, a parallel world where consequence was a concept for other people. The flights on the Lolita Express were not holidays. They were business trips into the heart of a moral abyss. Every trip, every party, every introduction was a small calculated betrayal of the institution that gave him everything. He wasn't just a guest in this world. He was a willing shareholder in its darkness. And that darkness began to demand its dividends. The bill arrived in the form of a civil lawsuit filed in a New York court. Its name, Pause, Virginia Giuffre versus Pause Prince Andrew. This was not a negotiation. It was an inventory of sins presented for public record. At its heart was a photograph, a grainy, awkward image that would become more famous than any royal portrait. Andrew, Ghislaine Maxwell, and a 17-year-old girl. His defense was an exercise in self-immolation. He claimed he couldn't sweat. He claimed he was at a Pizza Express in Woking on the night in question. Each denial was a shovel of earth on his own reputation. Then came the interview. The car crash interview on BBC Newsnight was a fatal mistake, a televised confession of breathtaking arrogance and poor judgment. He thought he was clearing his name. Instead, he was signing a public verdict. The settlement that followed wasn't an exoneration. It was the purchase of silence for an undisclosed sum, rumored to be, pause, £12 million. A fortune paid to make a problem disappear. But the stain on the monarchy's ledger remained, written in indelible ink. The purchased silence was temporary. A digital tomb was waiting to be unsealed. The Jeffrey Epstein files were not a single document, but a sprawling, cancerous archive. A posthumous audit of a dead man's empire, and Andrew was listed as a key asset. The first wave of declassified papers landed like a cluster bomb. They were a cold, factual chronicle. Flight logs placing him on Epstein's private jet, schedules detailing meetings long after Epstein's first conviction, email chains, stripped of emotion, confirming continued contact. These weren't allegations anymore. This was data. The shadows of the past now had timestamps and metadata. The documents reportedly contained images, new threads in a web everyone hoped was decaying. Each redaction, each black bar, was a promise that the story was not over. The worst parts were still hidden in the server farms and evidence lockers of the Department of Justice. The world learned that Andrew's connection wasn't a brief, regrettable chapter. Pause. It was a long-running series, and the final season had not yet aired. The firm does not panic. It calculates. While the world consumed the lurid details, the palace initiated a protocol of containment. This was not a family crisis. It was a brand integrity audit. The monarchy, an ancient corporation built on image, was assessing a damaged asset. Inside the walls of Windsor and Sandringham, a quiet, brutal triage began. The king, Charles, a man long prepared for the crown, saw the situation through the cold lens of survival. The institution had to be firewalled from the man. Pause. His mother's sentimental attachment, a well-documented weakness for her favorite son, was now a historical footnote, a liability. The meetings were held in rooms without windows. The decisions communicated in clipped, sterile tones. This was the anatomy of his exile, orchestrated not by politicians, but by his own blood. The stripping of titles wasn't a punishment. It was a managed bankruptcy, a severing of a gangrenous limb before the infection could reach the heart of the crown itself. They built a wall of silence around him, a silence more damning than any public condemnation. His isolation was the final, necessary step in the inventory of his sins. The sentence had been passed. Then came the call from across the water. Washington's request was not a polite inquiry. It was a summons, wrapped in the stiff fabric of diplomacy. The United States Congress, an entity immune to the mystique of royalty, saw only a key witness in a federal investigation, a loose thread in their own posthumous audit of Epstein. This was the true internationalization of his disgrace. The pressure was no longer just from tabloids and public opinion, it was geopolitical. For Andrew, this was the final, fatal turn of the screw. His refusal to testify, born of legal necessity, looked like pure guilt. A fatal error. He was trapped in a silent scream between two choices: potential perjury under oath or the certainty of condemnation without it. His silence became a fortress made of glass. Everyone could see the terrified man inside. Pause. This new pressure accelerated his fall. He was no longer just a royal embarrassment, he was a diplomatic liability, a walking security risk. The eviction from Royal Lodge ceased to be a mere family squabble. It was now a matter of statecraft, severing the last vestige of a defensible position. His name was now a permanent fixture in the wreckage of an empire of filth, and the American justice system has a very, very long memory. That long memory began to foreclose on his reality. The eviction was no longer a threat. It was a logistical exercise in dismantling a life. The move from the 30-room grandeur of Royal Lodge to the relative modesty of Marsh Farm was the anatomy of his fall, rendered in brick and mortar. They say his most valuable artworks were the first to go. A quiet, orderly procession of gilded frames and old masters, each one a relic from a life he could no longer claim. This was not a move. It was an evacuation from his own history. Pause. The past was a country from which he was now permanently exiled. The calls from captains of industry ceased. The invitations to Davos and St. Moritz evaporated into the ether. There was only the silence of a man who had become inconvenient, a ghost haunting the corridors of his own family. The crash wasn't loud. It was the deafening quiet of a phone that no longer rings, in a house that is no longer yours. This quiet is the final verdict. His prison is not made of stone, but of public memory, a digital tomb from which there is no escape. Every search query, every archived article is another bar on the window. This is the unspoken testament of his past. The ledger is closed, the accounts audited, and the balance shows a catastrophic deficit of judgment. He traded a birthright of honor for the fleeting currency of a predator's world. A fatal transaction. Pause. There will be no third act, no redemption tour, only the long, slow sentence of being pause. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, a name now synonymous with a spectacular and irreversible disgrace. The monarchy, in its ancient, brutal wisdom, amputated the limb to save the body. What remains is a man left with nothing but his choices, and the bitter inheritance of their consequences. The crown can be passed down. Dignity cannot.